All right, hey there, it's Keith Hayden, and I'm back with another quick video to help you improve your fiction writing by talking about Chinese dramas. Now, maybe this is a genre of storytelling that you haven't really heard much about, or maybe you've seen something online about it, but it's not something that I've seen a lot of authors talk about because, frankly, they don't have enough experience to talk about it. But I myself have watched over 4 dozen Chinese dramas, full Chinese dramas, like all the way through. I watch them a lot. And in that time, I've learned a ton about storytelling and I've picked up a ton of tips that I've boiled down to really the top 7 that I see that they do really well. They tend to do well in Chinese dramas that in Western fiction I don't see a lot, and it kind of conflicts with what I grew up reading and watching and then what I used to write. Now I've gotten better at implementing some of the things I've learned into my own stories, but I want you to be able to do that, and that's why I'm going to go through this checklist today. Speaking of checklist, I've created a little resource to go along with this video. It's a 29 item checklist that breaks down each of these 7 lessons into sub items. So when you're writing your novel or your long story, this is really meant for longer fiction, but you can use it, of course, if you're writing short stories or if you're writing microfiction, but it's really meant for novels. But when you're writing that story, you can go through and make sure that you've done these things when you're in the editing process to make your story even stronger and more memorable. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you like more stuff about writing, fiction, publishing, just creativity in general, just kind of a creative guy. So subscribe if you want to. With that, let's get into this list. So the first thing that I say is mix up your motivations. And what do I mean by this? When I wrote this, I was thinking of when it comes to character motivations. In a lot of Western media, the dominant motivation tends to be the characters fight for freedom. And I'm a Texas boy myself, so I understand that notion and I understand that motivation. And I feel like down from freedom is mobility, social mobility. There's also status sometimes. And there tends to be the bad guy just has a lot of power and he's taking away power from other people, and that needs to be balanced. That's a lot of Western media. Not all, of course, but I'm generalizing here. In Chinese dramas, they tend to be a little bit more diverse when it comes to character motivations. So maybe the character's motivated by status, or maybe they're motivated by money, or maybe they're motivated by they just like adventure, or they like the thrill of the fight. These motivations, of course, change throughout the story, but this is just something to keep in mind, that it's important to mix things up, and it makes it a lot more interesting when even the characters that are on the same side have different motivations, and then seeing how those motivations conflict. Maybe he cares about love and all she cares about is getting a better job, but they're married. That might be something interesting to explore. And then find ways to play with those motivations. How do they come in conflict with each other? How do they change as the story moves on? This is something to definitely keep track of that you can steal from Chinese dramas into your own stories. Next thing is always make it personal. You've got to always, whatever your antagonist is or whatever conflict that your characters are coming up against, you have to make it personal. I don't care if it's a rainy day. It might be God just raining down on them and making them have a bad day, something like that. But I see this in Chinese dramas where a big part of the story is that it's the character's fate. It's a very common Chinese drama trope to where they're fighting against fate, but it's not just this kind of nameless destiny. The destiny will often take physical forms. Maybe it's a god that comes down from the heavenly realm. This is a very common Chinese drama trope. If you watch Chinese dramas, you know what I'm talking about. When they come down in human form and then they test the hero and they put him through all these different trials and things like that. And then the hero kind of has to do that. And in that way, they challenge fate in that way. So get creative with how you embody your obstacles and always make it personal. You've got to make them their brother, their mother. I mean, these are the relationships that we fight for in real life. In your real life, you probably have parents or guardians. Maybe you have a brother or sister, or you have a best friend that you would lay down your life for. Without that, it's really difficult to get readers invested in your story because they're like, what are the stakes here? Like, what are we fighting for? But when it's personal, there's always a reason to fight. So keep that in mind. The next one is create interesting social graphs. And this is something that Chinese dramas are so strong at doing. And I'm always like, and you can definitely take this too far, right? To where it's his mother's stepbrother, but she was in love with his younger brother. And now, but they're both in different warring nations or different rival schools or something like that. It gets really dicey to where you just you're trying to put it in your head and it's really hard to figure out, okay, what's going on here. Point is, you don't have to get that fancy with it, but you should move beyond the standard, okay, mom, dad, the brother, sister. This is a common setup in a lot of Western fiction. Or maybe there's a step parent or step brother or something, but it typically doesn't go beyond that. It's usually pretty linear, like family tree. And that's just not as interesting as when you see these different social lines cross or these different backgrounds or just these different types of relationships that really spice things up. So get creative with your social graphs, throw some other people in the mix. And if you need some help for ideas, go on my website, keithhayden.net. I'll put a link in the description of this video. And I've got my story generator that can come up with different jobs, occupations, just different people and characters just to spin up some ideas. The next one is even friends fight. And I put it this way because I was recently reading something to where if they were family or if they were aligned ideologically, they never really had any conflict. And that's just not one, it's not realistic. I mean, maybe I'm sure you fought with your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad for something. Sometimes it's a little thing, it's completely insignificant. Sometimes it's a big deal. But we have to show that conflict in our stories. You definitely should, because one, it's realistic. Two, it's just always interesting. At least it always gets my attention when in a story when two people who shouldn't be fighting start fighting. It's just nobody likes that. Nobody likes to see a brother against a brother or a sister against a sister or two best friends going at it. Nobody really likes to see that in real life or in fiction. It's always going to get people's attention. Of course, just like all of these things, got to use them in moderation. A whole story can't just be all arguments, but there should be disagreements that make sense with the plot of your story. Chinese dramas are great at this. They do it all the time. It's in fact they will just string these together to where the family members will be on different sides, and then the circumstances of the plot will shift them around to where, okay, this time he's got this point of view, now she's got this point of view, and what do we do? But we don't agree on something. So sometimes it's just an argument, other times it's an actual fight. Keep that in mind. The next thing is slow down, and this goes against a lot of. I've been reading a lot of writing craft books and storytelling craft books, and in a lot of Western thinking when it comes to mainstream popular media, is that backstory is bad. Spending too much time in the character's head or talking about the past, talking about things that don't move the plot forward is a generally bad thing because it takes the reader out of the story, it slows it down, all that stuff. Part of me understands this because you can definitely go crazy with backstory to where it just feels jarring and it doesn't fit with the circumstances of the story. But at the same time, I really like backstory. Growing up, I played a lot of Japanese role playing games, and I would always look forward to the points in the story where they stopped and explained, okay, who is this hero we're playing as, or who is this bad guy that we're fighting against, or anything like that, because it does add texture to the story and it really catches you up as a player and as someone experiencing that story. Point is, in Chinese dramas, they dedicate a lot of time, sometimes whole episodes, to backstory. And in a 45-minute show, that's a lot of backstory. But the way they do it is is what makes it memorable and what makes it keep the story flowing without bringing it to a standstill. How do we do this in fiction? Well, my thinking is you can I do it in a couple of different ways. One, you can just change the POV. So if your POV has been your main heroine for most of the book, change it to the her brother or a secondary character or even the antagonist. And what's that relationship like? Why are they fighting against each other? That's always interesting to me, especially if it's done later in the book when we've already seen them clashing. Another way you can do it is just totally break the formula of your story. I did this one time in my first novel, Sirius and Limnic. I had one chapter where it was just the POV was from a dog's perspective. And of course, there was no dogs that were the main heroes. And that was how I introduced another character, just kind of this it was a shorter chapter, but it was a metaphor for this character that I was going to introduce. So that's another way, just completely out of nowhere, just change it up. Just do something random to the reader, but of course have it relevant to the story. And the other way is just to go full flashback. Make the whole there's several ways to do flashbacks. You can make it a dream, you can make it um, the character in an interesting situation, but where they have time to think, of course, where they would actually be flashing back, but where they have time to actually slow down. Point is, you should put backstory in there, and it's one of those things that I I, I conflict with myself as a writer because I understand, growing up in the United States, I understand the need to keep the plot moving, and I definitely like a fast moving story, but at the same time, backstory is so important. And I like writing backstory, and I like taking chances and risks with the backstory. So keep that in mind. Next one is blend genres. And this is something that I didn't come to appreciate about Chinese dramas until a couple years after I had been watching them. But it's very common for a Chinese drama to be labeled as a comedy or as an action or as an adventure show. And then 5 episodes in, it's a romance or or it turns into a serious maneuvering political drama. Now, of course, there's things about expectations and audience, and this is the Western mentality of, well, you've got to honor your audience and you've got to make sure that, if they're looking for a women's romance, then it should be women's romance 80% of the way through. Don't throw a gunfight in there or something like that. I understand that, and that definitely helps tell a tight story, but exploring different genres and throwing other elements in there and not just a one-off or something like you throw a gun in there and now it's a crime or something like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like you dedicate a significant amount of time to adding other genres in there. I think that can be a good thing if it's well done. It's easy to overdo it, it's easy to screw this up. It takes a little bit more experience, but the point is, this is something that is common in Chinese dramas to where it will shift. But the goal is less on staying in the genre lane and more in staying in the story lane. So if the story calls for action, then there's going to be action. But if it calls for romance, now it's got the romance in there. Point is, don't be afraid to dedicate significant parts of your story to different genres. Experiment, have fun. The last thing is to exaggerate, and this is something that I really enjoy about Chinese dramas because they will take the most mundane scene and they will make it into a big deal with certain camera angles and sound effects and whooshes and whoosh, they'll just zoom in on somebody's face or something like that. Of course, you can't do this in fiction because you don't have the visual, but you can what I call control the camera by describing certain camera angles, by setting. The way I think of it is setting a stage in my mind. I used to do theater when I was in high school, so that's where I learned about blocking and stagecraft and presence and all these different things. And I bring that to my fiction because I definitely think of, okay, where am I placing these people in space? I'm not just randomly putting people, he was over here, she was there. No, I'm placing them in a room. He's sitting down, she's standing up. He's in bed, she's at the table. That type of thing. Think about that as you're going, because when you set that stage in your mind, it allows you to have a sort of camera with your words and control where the reader's eye is directed. And I think you can do that with exaggerations. You can also do that with metaphors and similes as well. You can definitely ramp things up by using certain metaphors where it still fits with the scenario, but it's taking things to a level that you're like, okay, this is a little bit crazy and beyond. And I know I tend to exaggerate things in real life, and that definitely helps me with fiction because I can exaggerate things on the page as well. So that's the end of the list. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there's a 29 item checklist that you can check out. The link is in the description, and hopefully that helps you stay on track with your story and add some of these things in. As I mentioned before, use all of these in moderation. You should definitely not go through and exaggerate your whole story or have your whole story be flashback. You know that. But these are tools that you can use that I don't think are very well known in the Western world, because I don't think a lot of Westerners watch as many Chinese dramas as I do, or maybe they're not as familiar with the genre. And speaking of that, I encourage you to check out a Chinese drama. Most of the ones that I watch either through YouTube or Amazon Prime. They're not very difficult to access. They have subtitles, and they're just a lot of fun. They're just a really fun genre. So thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was helpful. And make sure to subscribe and like the video if you thought it was helpful. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.